All right, guys, welcome to the stream. Today, we're trying something a little new, trying to stream on YouTube, where we stream most Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. between 1 p.m. and 1:30 Eastern Time. But we're trying streaming today on Instagram. So if you're watching over on Instagram, if anything goes wonky on there, you can come over to YouTube and you're going to find us there as well. But today, we want to talk about this NDA project that we launched earlier this week. We want to talk all things NDAs in church. I want to answer your questions. We got a bunch of questions that are queued up from social media over the last couple of days, but we also want to answer your questions live. So Instagram, YouTube, go ahead and ask us those questions. We're going to try to get to as many of those as we can today. And we're going to explain a little bit about this NDA project that we launched that we believe is going to end the use of what we call silencing NDAs. Not all NDAs, but we believe that this project over the next 4 to 5 years will make it not worth it to use silencing troublesome, problematic NDAs the way that they have been used in the past. Okay, so we really believe in this project. I'm going to explain to you a little bit more about that, but for all of the information, if you have not watched episode 100 yet, you can watch that on YouTube. It's the most recent video that is up there for us about NDAs, or you can watch or listen on Spotify or Apple. If you have not listened to episode 100 yet, a lot of your questions are going to be answered there. A lot of the basics are answered there. I had 2 pastors as well as Nathan Apfel, the filmmaker of The Religion Business. They were on there. We had a full panel discussion. So again, if you have not checked out episode 100, please put that on your list, because it is going to answer a lot of the basic questions. I'm going to try to go beyond those questions today. Also, wanted to go ahead and show you guys where you can find more information. Okay, where you can find, and actually, let me to a little bit different spot so you can see it a little bit better. If you go to spiritualabuse.institute, right there on the front page, you're going to see this button, Church NDA Disclosure Database. If you go to spiritualabuse.institute, you check that out. This also has all of the information. We're going to talk about here in a minute what we actually define as a silencing NDA, okay? But you can go over here. This shows you everything. This is going to show you the database, which is empty for about, I don't know, between 14 and 21 more days. We've already got churches in the process that are going to be on this database. We give them 14 days to respond. There's some work that we have to do, but within the month, there are going to be churches that are actually on this database listed alphabetically by state. So you can find out all of that information there, but you can also, if you're a person who says, hey, I know of a church that uses NDAs, I've got access to an NDA that I feel like needs to be shared. Again, these are always voluntary. We're not asking you to give these. These are voluntary if you want to give these, but you can go through, click that button, how to submit an NDA, and it's actually going to show you how to do that. Those submissions have already been coming in. So thank you guys so much for being a part of that, okay? And that's just a little bit difficult, but we are getting there. So if you want more information, go to spiritualabuse.institute. You're going to find it right there on the front page. Also, let me know where you're watching from today. We always like to do that on YouTube. So if you're on Instagram, you can do that as well, but let me know where you're tuning in from. And then throughout the day, please put in the chat any questions that you have about NDAs. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. What is this NDA project if you have not heard? Because this is one of the projects that I am most proud of. It's also one of the scariest projects, to be honest, that we have ever done. We launched a project earlier this week on Tuesday with episode 100 that is a public disclosure database of churches that have been reported to us to use silencing NDAs, okay? So if we get an NDA and we get a report from a whistleblower that a church is using NDAs, we're going to reach out to them. We're going to tell them what we got. We're going to ask them for comment. And then we are going to publish that or not publish the NDA, but publish the church that uses the NDAs along with their comments, everything that they've said. It's going to go on that public disclosure database. So you know, if my church is using NDAs, you know, and you can have a conversation with them. If a church that you're attending and you're thinking about maybe joining this church, or you're moving into a new community and you're wondering if a church is safe or not, you've heard really good things about it, you can go on and see if they are using NDAs just by looking at this database, okay? Now, the other thing that we're going to do, we're going to have a whole other list where we celebrate churches that make a public commitment to not use NDAs, and we're going to link that public commitment. So again, if you're going on staff at a church, you can find, do they use NDAs? Have they made a commitment not to use NDAs? And so if they've made that commitment, we're not going to use silencing NDAs. We want to be above reproach. Let's say they make that commitment and then they try to hand you an NDA. Well, now you have the power, authority, and influence to say, no, you said you weren't going to do this publicly. We're not going to do that. My severance doesn't need to be tied to this, okay? So all of that is wrapped up in this project. And what we're doing is we're allowing anonymous whistleblowers, if you have access to an NDA that a church has used that you believe is a silencing NDA, we're going to talk about what that is here in just a second, and you want to send that to us, you can submit it anonymously, okay? And we are going to do our very best to protect your data. If you go on the website, you can see our data protection policy. It is very robust. We're doing everything that we can to protect whistleblowers, because even if it's not your NDA that you're sharing, we know there can be a lot of pushback from churches. So we actually allow you to share this completely anonymously. We store everything on Swiss servers. They are never downloaded. These are servers with end-to-end encryption, zero access encryption. So we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we are protecting whistleblowers as they do this, and that we're being fair and honest with these churches, but also just saying, hey, we're not going to let NDAs be used in darkness to harm people anymore. We're going to try to bring this into the light. And guys, honestly, how far this project goes really just depends on how many people how many people are able to share these NDAs with us, right? Because I think that's the only thing that could stop a project like this is if there's not enough people who feel like they can share. So that is our goal, just to bring all of this into the light. So let's start with this. A lot of people have asked us, Jeff, what do you consider a silencing NDA? So let me give you some examples, and then we're going to get to just a Q&A where I'm answering your questions that you guys have sent in previously, and any questions that you were asking today. Go ahead and put those in the chat. But here's how we define a silencing NDA, because we're going to talk about with some of these questions. Not all NDAs are created equally. Not NDAs are wrong. Not all NDAs are sinful. But the majority of NDAs that we see in churches are what I would call silencing NDAs. And we define a silencing NDA as any formal or informal agreement that's used by a church or ministry to restrict a person's ability to speak, okay? So they can't speak freely about their experience. They can't tell the truth about their experience. And there's a lot of different ways this can look. The most common way that we see NDAs is actually a severance agreement. Most of these documents are not going to say they're NDAs. So we see NDAs that are severance agreements. And you'll have somebody who gives this to you and says, hey, in order to get your severance payment, you've been fired. You can't file for unemployment because you work at a church. So if you want any money and be able to pay the bills, you have to sign this separation agreement, this termination agreement, this severance agreement. And in that agreement, a lot of times there are tucked in clauses, like non-disparagement clauses, that make this dangerous and will keep you from being able to tell the truth about your experiences, good, bad, even sin, at times criminal misconduct, okay? We also say this: any document that has a non-disparagement clause in it, even if it's just a single clause, this could be an employee handbook, it could be a separation agreement, doesn't matter. Any document that has a non-disparagement clause in it, that is going to be an NDA, okay? So again, these could be HR handbooks, employee handbooks. This is any agreement as well. We're going to call a silencing NDA any agreement that would require you to uphold the agreement, to lie about your experience or frame your experience in theological language, right? Any agreement that keeps you from criticizing a concern that you have about a church, okay? We got more information about that on the website, but that's kind of the basics here. So what I want to do is I want to get in today, and I want to go ahead and be able to just walk through some questions that you all have likely had, okay? Some questions y'all have sent, some questions you got today. We're going to get into as much of this stuff as we can. I'm going to go ahead and share. Let me share another screen so I can show you these questions that we got beforehand. Some of them I've actually had to go ahead and make sure I took some personally identifying information off of them, but let's go ahead and talk about these questions. And again, as we talk about these questions, let me know any questions that you have as we go through this today. But the first question we get a lot, let's start with this one. What's an NDA? We talked about some of those a minute ago, but an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. An NDA is a non-disparagement agreement. But again, most of these documents that we see that are NDAs, silencing NDAs that keep people silent about their experiences, that muzzle people for hush money, the majority of them are not going to actually say non-disclosure agreement at the top. Most of the time, churches are going to say, well, this isn't an NDA, it's a separation agreement, okay? And I've already heard that from churches. And we have to come back and say, okay, but that a separation agreement with that stuff in it, that is an NDA, okay? So we've got to get past that. It does not have to be called or labeled an NDA to be an NDA, okay? But again, that non-disclosure agreement is anything that's going to keep you from speaking freely about what's going on, any agreement with a non-disparagement clause in it, any agreement with an overly broad confidentiality clause in it. Usually there's going to be something like hush money that is what they call consideration for this. Okay, well, you can't say anything about your experience for this payment of money. Sometimes it's you can't say anything about anything you see that you're concerned about in exchange for we're going to give you a job, right? But that's an NDA. They're going to offer you something, and in exchange for what they're offering you, they're going to ask you to be quiet about your experiences. Now, a good NDA is actually going to be, and we'll talk about some of this here more in just a minute, but a good NDA is going to protect you, okay? It's going to protect parishioners. It's going to protect the people of the church. A bad NDA is going to protect the institution and the leaders at the expense of truth, okay? So again, when you're looking at an NDA, ask the question, who is it protecting? Is it going to require anybody to lie? Is it going to require anybody to overlook immorality? Could it be used in that way? And if so, that's a bad NDA. But that question, what is an NDA? It's any of those documents, no matter what they're called, that have any of these markers that we have on the website of a silencing NDA. Another question, somebody said, Jeff, how do you collect this data? Okay. And this person actually had a couple of really good questions. How do you collect this data? And again, those websites are those details are very, they're much more broad and detailed on the website. So you can go to spiritualabuse.institute and see that. Okay. But again, we collect this data. We take it through Proton Mail. We ask people to send it through Proton Mail. We don't want you to share any of your personal data with us. You don't have to tell us who you are. You don't have to tell us any of that. And again, the reason why we use Proton Mail and Proton servers is because those are Swiss servers, end-to-end encrypted, zero access encrypted, so that you are protected. You can send this completely anonymously if you follow the steps, because we don't want to harm anybody for blowing the whistle. Okay. So after this person asked, they said, hey, how's the data collected? They also said, is it self-reported or do you guys investigate the claims? Okay. And again, I told them there's a lot more of this detail on the website, but we don't really investigate the claims. And this is very important for people to know because we're not investigators. Okay. And just like we call out churches that are trying to investigate wrongdoing themselves, when we say you're not investigators, you shouldn't be doing an independent investigation. It's not independent if you're doing it. That's a self-investigation. Okay. You need to do an independent investigation when there's allegations of sin, wrongdoing, criminal behavior, spiritual abuse of any kind. Okay. Well, it's the same thing. We're not investigators. Okay. But we are an advocacy organization. We do journalism work. We are a watchdog organization. Okay. So any document that we get actually has to pass a 3-part test. Okay. It has to pass a 3-part test. Number one, is it consistent with the hundreds, if not thousands, of church NDAs that we have seen at this point? Okay. Is it consistent with what we would expect a church NDA to look like? And there's a lot of different variation there, but that's the first test that it has to pass. Okay. After that, does it have markers? Does it have one or more markers of a silencing NDA? If it doesn't have those negative markers, we're going to kick it back to you and go, this is an NDA, but it's not one of those that is actually problematic that we're trying to bring awareness to on this database. Okay, so we would kick it back there. So is it consistent with other NDAs? Does it have the markers of a silencing NDA? Those are the first few tests that it actually has to pass. And then we reach out to churches for review. Okay, we reach out to churches for review. We tell them, hey, here's what we got. We're not sharing the document with them. Okay, we're protecting that. But we said, we've received a document. Do you have a comment? And again, we're going to share their comment, their clarification, anything they want, unedited and unaltered right there on the website. So you can see this is what was submitted to us. This is what this church said. And if those are not congruent, we're going to let you know. Okay, what this church said does not match what we saw. We're just letting you know what is out there. You can ask questions about this. You can make your own decision there. Okay. Another question that we got is a termination agreement with the words non-disparagement agreement considered to be an NDA. So going back to what we talked about just a minute ago, yes, any termination agreement with a non-disparagement clause, even if it's not called a non-disparagement clause. Okay. So you may be saying, Jeff, what's non-disparagement? Non-disparagement means we can't say anything that would be negative or critical or paint you in a bad light. Okay. Defamation means we're saying something that's false to try to hurt you. Disparagement is we're saying something that is critical or negative, could harm your reputation, but it's true. Okay. There are already laws for defamation, so you don't need that in one of these documents. So anytime you see a non-disparagement clause, you see those words, or you just see a clause that says you can't criticize the church, you can't say anything that might embarrass them, that would make it an NDA by itself. Okay. So again, it doesn't have to say non-disclosure agreement, but it doesn't even have to say non-disparagement agreement or non-disparagement clause. Just the clause being there, no matter what it's called, would make this an NDA. AKA Morton said, would the misuse of non-disparagement agreements fall under this category? Do you have an episode that talks about these? We actually have We have an episode that we did early on in the podcast where we looked at NDAs and evangelical secrets in 2 episodes. And we talk about this more in detail. But again, yes, any non-disparagement agreement or clause is going to fall into this category and be that NDA. Another person asked the question, if you think a church did an NDA, but you aren't sure, what should we do? And this is a good question because we all want to make an impact, but it's also very nuanced. If you think a church is using an NDA, but you're not sure, there's not a lot that we can do with that unless someone is willing to either send a document or someone is willing to go on the record to talk about this. Okay. So if somebody's willing to send a document, that is actually the easiest way for us to do this. The only way that we can actually put a church on this list or start this process with a church where we don't have a document. Somebody reached out yesterday and they said, I know this church uses NDAs, but I don't have a copy of the document. They don't give anybody a copy of the document. So what I told this person was I said, hey, if we have at least 3 people come forward that will say, yes, they use NDAs, we've seen them, and at least one person out of those 3 will go on the record. So it's got to be more than one person going on the record, but I've got to talk to 3 people. If they'll do that, then we can start this process without a document. Otherwise, we need a document. I know that's a frustrating thing because you may know a church is using an NDA, but you can't prove it, or you don't have that document, or you can't go on the record. So we're not asking you to do anything that would put you in danger or anything that you can't do. We're just saying those are kind of the only ways that we can actually work through this process. We're not going to be able to deal with this with every church, but we can actually address this with a lot of churches. Okay. Adam says, is there a way to give an indicator if it's a church with a high volume of NDAs they've used, like a pro or an elite status if they've been reported more than 5 times? So we're not going to call it a pro status or an elite status, but I told Adam, we're going to actually note right there in the database if we've gotten multiple submissions. So basically, if we've gotten 3 or more submissions for a church, we're going to note that we've gotten multiple submissions, 3 or more for this church, which raises the likelihood that there is something that needs to be dealt with here. Got to be careful how we say these things because there are a lot of churches that are going to get really frustrated about this stuff. Okay. But we think it's important for public transparency that if we've heard from multiple people that a church is using NDAs, you will know that. So that will not be on the database right off the bat because we're working off of brand new submissions. But later on, as we get more submissions, we're going to know any church that has used a lot of these. Okay. Another great question. Started out kind of the same, but asked something a little more nuanced. What if a church has multiple NDAs? Of course, we're going to note that. But how do you prevent narrative spinning? So what this person is talking about, how do you prevent a church when you reach out to them with their comment from spinning the narrative and trying to make it sound like they're not doing anything wrong? And this is a great question because churches that use these kind of agreements are very good usually at spinning the narrative, okay? Whether they mean to do that or not, they're usually very proficient at this, okay? So how do we deal with that? Well, again, if we've got a document in hand and the comments that the church is giving us doesn't match what we're seeing, okay, we're going to talk about that in the article and we're going to link that article in the database, okay? So for instance, this is a great example. Let's say we have a church we reach out to and they say, we don't use NDAs, we use separation agreements with non-disparagement clauses. Well, then I'm going to say, okay, they say they only use separation agreements with non-disparagement clauses. But based on this review and based on their information, that actually qualifies as an NDA. So they may spin that narrative, but we're going to give you factually what we see. Or if we say, hey, this is kind of the stuff that we're seeing in some of these documents, we've got concerns. They say they've never used this. This looks to be consistent and legitimate from us. We've had it reviewed by other experts. So while we can't say for certainty that they use it, it looks to be consistent and looks to come from this church. Okay. So if that makes sense, the way we're going to prevent narrative spinning is by simply reporting what we're seeing and any disconnect that we're seeing. We're not going to report a lot of opinions, and that's going to frustrate some of you because I've got plenty of opinions. But this particular project, we need to be very careful that we're reporting facts, and then we're letting you decide what to do with those facts as we see them, as much as we can gather them. And then we're putting accountability in your hands. You can go have conversations with these churches. You can have conversations with friends and family members. You can ask the church to give you more information than maybe what they have given us. But we think that's going to do a good job of cutting through the spin, cutting through the narrative spinning. So that was a great question. Another one that got sent in: what happens if the ministry lies about using them? Okay. I just sent one over, and people tend to lie. Okay. Again, I can't say anything with detail about these, but I can tell you there are already responses that I have gotten from a few of these submissions. When we've reached out for comment, there are already responses I've got, sometimes even through the grapevine, where things don't match up what we've seen. So just like the narrative spin, whether they're spinning or they're flat out lying, we're going to report what we've seen. So if a church says, we've never used NDAs, and we've never used NDAs before, that's fake news. Okay. All right. Well, then we're going to report, we've got this document. The church says they've never used these NDAs. This looks consistent with other NDAs. It looks like it's used from this church. So we're going to let you ask these questions. Okay. Now, if the church says we've never used NDAs, I'm also going to ask them the question, okay, would you be willing to make a commitment to not use silencing NDAs in the future and make it publicly available? And if so, we're going to put them on that other list. We're going to celebrate them. Okay. Even if they've used these NDAs in the past, we're going to celebrate them making a public commitment to move forward. But what I have a hunch we're going to find is there's probably going to be a decent amount of churches that say we've never used NDAs, and then they aren't willing to make a public commitment that they're not going to use NDAs. Okay. So again, we will report that, and you will see what they're saying versus kind of what we've seen, and is it congruent. All right. Another person said, when is an NDA typically presented to someone and appropriate to use in the church? This is a great question because, again, we're not against all NDAs. Okay. So here's some NDAs that are presented that are good, and we think they could be helpful in the church. I'm not saying that you should use them, not saying that we're recommending for pastors to use them, but we don't see a problem with these organizationally, not for this database or anything like that. If a church is using an NDA and all it's doing is saying, hey, we're asking you're agreeing not to disclose personal or financial or counseling information for parishioners. Okay. So any personal information like addresses, phone numbers, stuff like that, you're not going to disclose that of parishioners. You're not going to disclose any financial information you find out from giving databases and stuff like that. You're not going to disclose anything that you hear while counseling a volunteer or while counseling a church member, unless it's an immediate danger to others, kind of like a therapist would do. Okay. Those kind of things, what do they all have in common? They protect parishioners. They protect the people of the church. What they don't have in common is none of them are actually just protecting the institution. They're not asking anybody to lie. They're simply saying protect private information. So all those are good uses of NDAs. If a church, and this is rare, but if a church actually has proprietary information that they need to kind of keep under wraps, and it's very rare that they would because we're not competing against each other, okay? But if they did, or if they're working with a vendor that has proprietary information, then using NDAs in a situation like that would also be good, okay? The best example I can come up with would be if, let's say, Life Church, because they did the Bible app, if they had for developers who were working on the Bible app, they had an NDA that said you're not going to explain to people our code and how the Bible app works and stuff like that, I would get it. An argument could be made that they don't need to do that, but I would also understand it. It wouldn't be something that would concern us that it could lead to spiritual abuse. So those are examples of NDAs that I think could be good to use. Okay. This person said, we were asked to sign an NDA in exchange for severance pay back in May. And guys, let's just call that what it is. If you were asked to sign a document that controls what you can say for money, no matter what they call it, that's not severance pay. That is hush money. Okay. And that is, we're giving you hush money to keep you quiet or to control what you say. When we call it severance money, we can spend that. When we call that severance pay, we can spend that. When you call it hush money, it sounds more like the mafia than it does the church. So we need to call things what they are. But she said, we walked away, and the sad thing is they tried to disguise it as a termination agreement. No transparency in church is a huge red flag. Okay. So again, they were asked to sign an NDA for in exchange for severance pay. That was the consideration. And it wasn't called an NDA, it was called a termination agreement. Here's what a lot of churches are going to do. They're going to say, hey, this is just a severance agreement. We want to take care of you and your family. This is for your own protection, blah, 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 blah. You sign it because you need that money. You don't look at it very deeply, only later to realize this wasn't for my own protection. This was to control what I could and what I could not say. And that's why we see so many people who have regrets. They say, I wish, looking back on it now, that I didn't take that money. But we also, guys, I understand why church staff members especially would take it, because again, they're not going to have, in most cases, they're not going to have the ability to collect unemployment or anything else. So if you don't sign this, if you don't have enough money saved up or you don't have another source of income, then you won't be able to pay rent. You won't be able to pay your mortgage. You won't be able to put food on the table the next week. Okay. So it is very, very important that it is very important to note that when people sign these, that doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean that we hold anything against them, because guys, that is an excruciating decision. It is very hard to make that decision. My wife and I were able to say, no, we're not going to sign it, just like it sounds like this person was. But we also recognize a lot of people weren't in that place, which is why we eventually started doing this work. Okay. But I agree, Nani, that no transparency is a huge red flag. So again, regardless of what the terms are, we've got to look at the contents to decide if something is an NDA. And if it's a silencing NDA, that's going to be a problem. Okay. CD Campbell asked, where will the articles be published? All of the articles are going to be published on the SAI website. We're actually going to have a specific kind of tab just for articles, but we're also going to link the article that is written for each church. We're going to link it with the church's listing on the database. Okay, so you will see these articles. They're going to be very just kind of cut and dry, neutral, as factual as possible for the protection of everybody that's involved, but they're going to give you the information that is needed there. Okay. Random Youth Ministry Memes said they would not let me keep it, an NDA. Okay, so this person's been given, the person behind this account's been given an NDA. They wouldn't let me keep it. I signed it, and their lawyer took it back. And guys, I wish I could say that that is rare, but the reality is that's actually a smart play for the churches, because if they take it back, you can't ever release it. You can't ever expose it. You couldn't ever share it with anyone. The problem, though, is that you should never have a document that controls what you can do or what you can say that you don't have a copy of. Okay. So if you're going to sign it, I would just tell them, hey, one, if I'm ever going to sign a document of any kind, I need a copy of it. Okay. I need a copy of it before I sign it and after I sign it. Right. And I wouldn't sign anything that I could not get a copy of. I wouldn't sign an NDA anyway, but I wouldn't sign anything that I couldn't get a copy of, because if they're trying to get you to sign something and they're not giving you a copy of it, that is a huge red flag. There's something funny that's going on there. Okay. Now, Seth Neal had some concerns. We walked through these. I was really appreciative for Seth sharing some of these, but he had some concerns. I think they're really good to go through. He said, I appreciate this move. I think it's good, but I don't see what would stop a church from making this commitment and then continue to use NDAs, especially small ones. I'm going to take a leap and say that most churches that use NDAs in the first place don't really have trustworthy leadership in place. And I think that's a fair assumption, right? It seems that to put the burden on the next person given an NDA, who might not even know that their church made a commitment or be able to recognize that the document they've been given an NDA, that's a heavy burden. He also says there's also not any real anonymity here. The church is surely going to know who contacted you with their NDA. I want it to work, but I'm struggling to see it work as intended. And those are great concerns. Okay. Now, at the end of this, I'm just going to let you know, Seth said, hey, I missed some of these things. I don't think he'd watched episode 100 or looked at the website. So I think we were able to cover his concerns, but let's talk about these out loud, because I think it's important. Okay. One, when a church makes a commitment to stop using NDAs, it has to be a publicly available commitment. And we will link that commitment exactly where it is. So from a sermon, social media, on their website, we're going to link it on that list. So again, staff members, volunteers, parishioners in the future, you can see, does my church use NDAs or has my church committed not to? Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. Okay. But if that church says, oh, we're going to commit to not use NDAs and then use NDAs again, then you have the knowledge and power and authority to know that they lied publicly. Okay. Now, again, I cannot tell you what to do, but if it was me, I would probably say, hey, actually, here's what I'm going to need. I'm going to need that severance, and I'm going to need you to take out all the non disparagement stuff. I'm going to need you to take out all this other stuff because you committed publicly that you weren't going to use these. Okay. Now, I don't want to have to say anything about that, but if you're lying to the public, then I'm going to let them know. So either you can fix it or I'm going to let the public know that you are lying. Okay. Because I'm telling you, if we find out about that, man, there's probably going to be some people, I can't promise this, but there's probably going to be enough people who are going to put together a GoFundMe and take care of you anyway. But most churches, if they know that you know, they're going to go ahead and just give you the severance and say, okay, oh, we're so sorry, right? So again, this puts power and accountability back in your hands, all of our hands. Now, again, if a person doesn't feel comfortable saying anything and they don't, well, then we can't hold those churches accountable. But the best thing that we can do is put out there, they made this public commitment. Here it is. If you see them not following through on this public commitment, we're also going to give you the ability where you can contact us the same way that you would submit an NDA and let us know, and we will follow up because we will hold these churches accountable. Okay. If we get an NDA from a church that has said they're not using those NDAs anymore, and we can corroborate that it was after they committed that they weren't going to use those NDAs, okay, then guys, we are going to hold them to the max accountability that we can. Okay. We're not going to protect them whatsoever. Okay. So I think we're going to be able to hold churches to that commitment, but it's going to take all of us. Okay. Part of people not knowing what they're signing as NDAs, that's part of this project. Because by putting this on the database, by showing people what makes a silencing NDA, by talking about it in detail in videos like episode 100, but doing live streams like this, by putting together other resources, we're going to put together a template of a good NDA and a template of all of the examples of a bad NDA. We're going to be putting that together soon as well. So our hope is that we're helping people to recognize these. Now, Seth's other concern, very big concern. This is our biggest concern. Our biggest concern was the protection of whistleblowers. Okay. Because again, churches, when they feel scorned, even if it's okay and the person has the right to do this, when churches feel scorned, we know they can come after you. So we want to protect your anonymity at all costs. He says the church is surely going to know who contacted you with their NDA. I want to work. I'm just struggling to see it working as intended. And one of the things that I told him was they are not going to know who sent us their NDA because we don't share the NDA or any of the contents with them. We simply say we've received one and it fits the definition of a silencing NDA. Okay. We will never, not just to the church, we will never publish the contents of an NDA. We won't publish screenshots. I'm not going to talk about what's in an individual NDA on the podcast. The only way when we talk about NDAs that we'll talk about something in them, the only way we will talk about that is if it's something we have seen in multiple NDAs. Okay, so it will never be something that we have seen in just one NDA for your protection. Because part of the good news of this project is it allows us to research NDAs and see different ways that these things are being used. So if you get given an NDA, you haven't signed it yet, and you're not sure if it's a silencing NDA or not, send it to us. Submit it through the website. We will look at it within 24 to 48 hours, okay? And we're going to let you know, yes, this looks like a silencing NDA, or no, it doesn't, okay? And you can even tell us, I just want you to look at this. I don't want you to put the church on the database. I just need to know if what I'm signing is a silencing NDA or not. We'll let you know if it looks like it has those markers, okay? But because we're not sharing the contents of the document with a church, and if you send us a document, okay? If you send us a document and it is not redacted and we find personally identifying information in it, this has already happened. We kick it back and immediately delete the document from our servers. We do not want a document that can be traced back to you, but we're also not going to share those. The only way we would share those is if compelled by a court. Everything would be redacted. And we have a whole process for how we do that where it's immediately put on an encrypted hard drive. This is not going to be something that goes back to the church. We're doing everything within our power to keep it anonymous. And I think once Seth heard that, he felt much more comfortable about it. He actually said right here, sorry, I think it was a misunderstanding on that part of the process. And by the way, guys, you never have to be sorry for asking us questions. If we can't answer these questions, there's a problem, right? So we're going to try to answer these questions the best that we can. You never have to apologize. But he said, for some reason, I was thinking you would essentially be quoting the NDA back to the church. We would definitely not do that because this is a sad reality. Not all churches do this, but we've seen this too much. A lot of churches put Easter eggs in their non-disclosure agreements. They will change something ever so slightly on each agreement so that if they can read it, they have a way to know whose agreement it was, even if it doesn't say it explicitly. So we will never share the contents of the NDA for that reason. Okay. He says, I'm also considering my own situation in which there actually has only been one NDA. The church has only been around for 4 years and hasn't had many staff members. Didn't come across as argumentative at all. And I really appreciated that, Seth, for you sharing these concerns. And that is a concern. If you're a part of a small church and you're not sure if they've used any other NDAs before, then I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't send one even if you have access to it. Okay. But the majority of churches that use NDAs, they make it a regular process. So every termination, you're going to have NDAs, right? So once that happens, and I've seen that happen even at small churches with 100, 150 people. Once that happens, then they can have an idea of who it may be, but they can't come after you. And the larger a church is, because a lot of these churches that are using these are pretty big. They're large. They've used them, time after time after time. They cannot trace that back. Okay. So you got to know your own situation and what you feel comfortable with. This is, again, every submission that we take is 100% voluntary. We are not soliciting any sort of your submissions, because this is something that if you're going to submit an NDA, you need to feel comfortable that you can do that and that you're going to be safe with the parameters that we put in place. Katie actually said, a bill actually came out a couple of years ago making NDAs null and void if there's any kind of abuse or harassment. Now, I'm not sure about the bill. I haven't seen a bill, but I did tell her the National Labor Review Board, they came out a couple of years ago, and I think this is what she's talking about. They came out a couple of years ago and said NDAs with overly broad non-disparagement and confidentiality clauses are illegal because they restrict a person's ability to speak freely about their situations. Okay. Now, so that is true. The issue is they also say on that website, and said it within a couple of months, the federal government is not, and courts are not going to, they're not going to adjudicate this with churches. Because of separation of church and state, they're going to let churches do their own thing. The same reason why churches are one of the only organizations that don't have to pay unemployment insurance for you. It's the same reason why churches don't have to file tax returns or 990 forms. Churches, in a lot of ways, play by a separate set of rules. Because of separation of church and state, courts don't want to touch that kind of stuff, okay? So what is illegal for businesses is not necessarily illegal for churches. And we've seen a lot of churches using documents that, yes, they would be illegal as a business. They wouldn't fly, okay? And maybe they wouldn't even hold up in court, but the people who sign them don't necessarily know that, okay? There are also laws, plenty of laws in place. No court is going to hold you to an NDA. This is very important to know, but most people don't know it. No court that I know of, and I'm not a legal expert, so always consult with an attorney, but no court that I know of is ever going to hold you to an NDA when it's trying to silence any sort of criminal behavior, okay? But a lot of people don't know that. So what that means is a church, even though they know it wouldn't hold up in court, they could still ask you to sign an NDA and use it as a scare tactic to keep you from talking about abuse and criminal behavior, okay? And that's why states like Texas, North Carolina, I think, and Missouri, that's why multiple states have enacted what are called TRACE laws recently. And those are states that have enacted laws at a statewide level that says NDAs cannot be used to cover up abuse or anything like that. So that would make it, from my understanding, illegal for a church or an organization to even give you one of these NDAs. Right now, they won't hold up in court, but if you're not a part of a state that has those laws, they could still give them to you and try to keep you from actually talking about it, okay? But one of the other things that I said here to this person was, none of that protects people against spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, leadership abuse, okay? So NDAs can be used in a lot of these situations, and in most churches, they can be used. So that's why we need a project like this, and it's why we are not at a place where we can just rely on the law to protect people from NDA use in churches, because churches are the one place where it's kind of just like a free reign playground in most of these situations. I wish that wasn't the case, but it is the case in most of them, okay? Now, Dusty went back and forth with me for a while, And Dusty finally just quit. And I didn't really want him to quit. We want good conversation. This wasn't good faith conversation, but I will answer his concerns. I will answer his frustrations. And I'll show you how I answered those. But he said, so you're just making a list of every church in existence. It seems bitter to me. Now, first of all, I said, no, every church doesn't use NDAs. That's ridiculous. That's silly. That's ignorant. Okay. And guys, when I tell this person they're ignorant, if you're ever commenting with us and I say something's ignorant doesn't mean bad. Ignorant doesn't mean dumb. Ignorant means you're uninformed. You don't have the information about something that you're dealing with. And this person does not. Okay. Every church doesn't use NDAs. Okay. And many more churches that use NDAs, I have a hunch they wouldn't use NDAs if they knew they could be made public. Okay. So I said, you can call it bitter all you want, but that's simply ignorant, because this isn't out of a place of bitterness. This is out of a place of protection, transparency, accountability. We even say on the website, a church using NDAs doesn't mean they're abusive. Okay. A church being on that list doesn't even mean they still use NDAs, but we believe prevention is the best way to combat spiritual abuse. And we believe that transparency and accountability is the best way to bring prevention. Okay. I said, we're taking action on our mission to stop spiritual abuse because people matter to God, and he's called the church to a higher standard. Now, Dusty came back and he said, unless you go to a Baptist church with less than 100 people, or he actually said 10 people or less, then they have NDAs. That's 100% fact. Now, again, sometimes people will tell you something's 100% fact. That is not 100% fact. There are plenty of churches that have more than 10 people and aren't Baptist churches that don't use NDAs. Okay. The church is actually split on this. So there's surveys and there's data that says the church is split about half and half on whether they think NDAs should be used. Okay. And then it's split even further. It's split in like 4 or 5, 6 ways, but there's a good chunk of the church that says NDAs should never be used. Okay. So this is someone who's just throwing something out there as fact, calling it fact, but it's not. Okay. So he says, no, it's definitely just a spirit of bitterness. You're using the name of God to lie. I'm not sure what we're lying about. He never said what we were lying about. Again, the way that we're reporting this is just as factually as possible. We're showing both sides. But again, a lot of times when people disagree with you, especially people in the church, when they feel like you're causing division in the church by trying to bring accountability, they'll say things like this. Okay, but you just got to know when someone says, "Oh, you're a liar," well, help me understand what I lied about. Show me why that's a lie. A lot of times they can't do that at all. Okay. And if they do, it's very easily to just kind of cut through the bull and go, well, that actually wasn't a lie. Try again. All right. But he says using the name of God to lie and push your personal grievances should make you fearful, and it doesn't. I pray he heals your heart. And I wanted to share this as well, guys, because this is really a form of gaslighting. I pray he heals your heart is trying to make you feel, it's trying in that situation to make me feel like I'm crazy and this isn't legitimate and NDAs aren't a problem and I just have a bitter, unhealed heart, right? That is a form of gaslighting, right? And it just doesn't hold sway, okay? Because the only personal grievance I have with NDAs, I've already exposed a long time ago. That church will likely be on this list. We're giving them an opportunity to be a church that we celebrate even, right? And I hope that's what they do. So it's definitely not bitterness, because I would love to celebrate the church that gave me an NDA by saying, hey, they finally took a stand and said they're not going to use this. But I reminded him as well. I reminded him that this is not actually any bitterness, because this was a decision that was made over 9 months by our board. Okay. I don't even have a vote on the board. Okay. So this was my idea, but guys, it's had to change. It's had to morph because our board has been looking at what is the best way to deal with this. And I don't think anybody else on the board has signed an NDA or has family members who have signed an NDA. Maybe one or two people did, but this is not something that our board was bringing up or was just pushing through. This was actually very difficult to get done. Okay. So again, I answered him. And I told him again, that was ignorant, told him why. But he says, I'm not ignorant. And again, I'm not saying he's an ignorant person. I'm saying he's ignorant in this situation. The answers he gave were ignorant. But he says, one of my gifts is discernment. You're lying to people because you're bitter. Now, again, this is a place where you can see forms of spiritual abuse. If this was done by a pastor or someone who had spiritual authority over me, it would be spiritual abuse. Right now, it's just ridiculous manipulation. Okay. So it's still manipulation here. It's not spiritual abuse because this person has no spiritual authority over me. There's no reason for me to really listen to them. Okay. But when you have a pastor or a church leader, or even someone who's been discipling you, someone you respect in the church, when they say something like, well, I have the gift of discernment, well, then they're telling you, I have a gift of the Holy Spirit. And if you disagree with it, then you're disagreeing with the Holy Spirit. Okay. Well, bro, I would say I have the gift of discernment too. The difference is I'm not leaning on discernment to explain to you why you're wrong. I'm leaning on facts. You're saying things are facts that aren't facts, and then leaning on discernment so that I can't argue with it. I have discernment, and my discernment tells me you're lying to people because you're bitter. My discernment says I'm not. That's not what I'm hearing from the Holy Spirit. And factually, you can't say anything that shows that I'm bitter, and that's why I'm doing this. You can't give any factual explanations of lies, but he's going to try. They just don't hold water. He says non-disclosure works both ways, and it isn't predatory. That's both true and untrue, right? And here's the reason, Dusty. In some documents we've seen, the non-disclosure and non-disparagement does work both ways. But I'll say that's rare, okay? But while non-mutual terms is a sign of a silencing NDA, mutual terms doesn't necessarily mean it's not a silencing NDA, okay? Because even if a church says, if you don't disparage us, we won't disparage you, that's still not helpful. Because everybody needs to be able to tell the truth, especially about any sort of potential abuse or immorality, okay? But non-disclosure can work both ways, and it can be non-predatory. That's why we give examples on episode 100. It's why we gave examples today. It's why we give examples on the website. Dusty wasn't interested in listening to any facts. Dusty was interested in trying to push his agenda and just trying to discredit us, but he did a poor job of it and just tried to blame it on the Holy Spirit, okay? He says, you choose to not sign it, though with consequences, okay? And it's very easy for someone to say that from the outside. You can choose not to sign it. Okay. But let me ask you, put yourself in the position of a church staff member who gets given this. If you have to make the decision, do I tell the truth and stand for truth with this church, or do I put food on my table, make sure that my kids and my wife can live indoors? Right? Do I make sure we're not homeless? Which decision are you going to make? Because I'll tell you, as someone who's been faced with the decision of going without money, even though we had plenty still, that's a hard decision. And I couldn't imagine being put in that place to make that decision, okay, if I didn't know how I was going to feed my family the next week. So it's really easy to say, oh, well, you don't have to sign it. A lot of people are having to make a really heinous choice. It is manipulative and it is toxic to tell them you have to choose between feeding your family and paying your bills or saying what we want you to say. So you can say whatever you want, Dusty. People say things like that, but it does not hold water. And even if you say they should still not sign it, I would say, okay, if you believe that, let's hold that over here. At the same time, the church should never make them choose between the truth and their family. And when the church is asking them to lie, to spin, to deceive, to not walk in the truth, when Jesus is the way, the truth, and life, when the church is not doing that, the church is in sin. So if you want to say the other person's in sin, go ahead. That's weird, but go ahead, okay? But you can't get away from the fact that this, in that situation he's describing, would still be sinful by a church that is trying to control what people are saying. Again, that's not every NDA, but that's what a lot of silencing NDAs lead to. Okay. He says, I'm sure you wouldn't want some of your past behavior to be public as well, or the details of whatever caused your termination. Okay. Now, again, people use this all the time. When we're doing exposure work with churches, they say, well, I bet you wouldn't want your past to be public. And the answer is no. None of us would want our past to be made public. But the difference is there's a very big difference in not wanting your past to be made public and hiding spiritual abuse, hiding SA, hiding CSA, hiding criminal behavior. There's a very big difference between that. There's a difference in I'm not automatically telling you my past behavior and asking other people to lie in exchange for a payment of hush money. Okay, there's a very big difference there. He also talks about, I don't know what caused your termination. Well, one, I didn't have to sign an NDA. The NDA was given to my wife to try to muzzle me, But I have no problem. I told you guys on the show before, I've told you guys on social media before, I was terminated. The reason I was given, because I actually have the receipts. I had good performance reviews. I had everything else. There was no moral failure. My boss said he was having his quiet time that morning, and the Lord told him it was time for me to be fired. Okay. So again, if he wants to stand by that and tell other people that's why he fired me, then have at it, man. And people can ask him why he felt that way. It's not what the Holy Spirit told me. Okay. But my wife, why was she terminated and given the NDA? She was terminated and given the NDA. They gave a few different reasons, but the main reason they gave was because of me, because they were afraid of what I may say. They were afraid that I had disunity with them. Okay. So I don't care to give you the reasons why she was given that NDA. I don't care to give you the reasons behind mine, because do I want to talk about it? No. But the difference is most people signing these things are not trying to hide this stuff. It's the churches that are trying to hide it. But this person continually wants to try to villainize people who sign NDAs, or villainize me, villainize SAI, because we're trying to do this project. Guys, what do we call that? If you don't recognize it, that is DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. He's denying that NDAs are used the way that they are and they're problematic. He's attacking me and SAI, and he's reversing churches that are giving people hush money and asking them to lie. He's reversing that situation and saying, well, that's not the problem. The problem is your sin. The problem is the people who signed these. That is DARVO. Okay. But he says, do you think it's godly to call out churches because you're personally bitter as opposed to trying to win hearts? And again, calling out churches and winning hearts are not mutually exclusive. Actually, part of the reason why we call out churches is because if churches don't call their own fouls and we keep facing all this scandal, by facing all this scandal, I think we're pushing people away from Jesus. I can tell the truth and I can expose sin and love people and point them to Jesus and share the gospel. The two aren't mutually exclusive. He said, Christ said, only God is good. And I'm sure you understand the context of that. That has no bearing on this conversation. Again, he's basically trying to say, unless you're God, you can't expose, which is not biblical because the New Testament is full of exposure. He says, no church is perfect, and we're not saying they are. We're asking them to not silence people with silencing NDAs. We're asking them to follow the biblical code of conduct there, which is to be above reproach. Above reproach doesn't mean perfect. Above reproach means even if I'm reproached, I can fix it. I can answer it. But it is a high standard because the Bible gives us that standard. Okay. But we're not saying they're perfect. But trying to destroy churches that are winning literal souls while you help no one by spilling grievances behind a mic is not helpful. Okay. So let's just talk about that. We're not trying to destroy any churches. And if you listened or you looked on the website, we're telling people that. I'm talking back and forth with the church right now, telling them this is how you can avoid being on this list. We're not trying to hurt you. We do want to hear your side of this story. Okay. We're not trying to hurt churches. We're trying to bring transparency and accountability behind a practice, the use of silencing NDAs, that has led to a lot of spiritual abuse, a lot of religious trauma, a lot of hiding of criminal behavior. It has led to a lot of sin. Okay, that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to destroy churches. A church winning souls does not also mean that they can't be in sin and need correction. Okay, and it is an excuse that a lot of people use. Well, how can this church be abusive if all these people are coming to Christ? Well, people can come to Christ and you can be hiding things and doing abusive things. Again, this guy seems to think, it's this logical fallacy that he thinks you can't have two things happening at the same time. Okay. But he says we're spilling grievances behind the mic. If you guys, when you look at these articles, you're going to see this. We're trying to be as fair as possible. We're not spilling grievances. We're simply saying this is what's been reported to us. This is what they said. Here are the concerns. Okay. Again, people, when you say the truth about things that are going on in the church, there are people within the church who will want to use DARVO to villainize you, to make you look like a sinner while ignoring the sin that you're literally exposing. Okay. And he says, I pray that you will change. I will not respond again. And then he responded again. No, I'm more concerned with souls than your personal grievances, logical fallacies. He accused me of straw man arguments because I asked him, I literally asked him, I said, so is what you're saying, help me understand this, is what you're saying that I'm more sinful essentially and SAI is more sinful for exposing this than the church is using the NDAs? Are you promoting NDAs? Like what's going on? This is what this sounds like. So wasn't a straw man argument, wasn't a logical fallacy. It was what you're saying doesn't make sense. This is how I'm taking it. Help me understand if I didn't. Okay. And he says those things aren't going to work on me. And what he's calling straw man arguments is essentially I push back with facts, which he did not like. But he said, stick to my literal words if you want to challenge him. So I told him, hey, man, look, you say you're more concerned with souls than your personal grievances. But if you're concerned with souls, then you're going to care about NDAs, period. You're going to care about NDAs and the damage they do on real souls through them. I said, you keep calling this a personal agreements. But again, that's factually untrue. Okay. And then I gave him the rest of this information. But the reason why I'm sharing that with you guys is so that you can see this is the kind of stuff that happens in churches a lot. When you know the playbook, when you know how gaslighting works, when you know how Darvo works, when you know how to respond factually without getting upset, when you know how to call sin what it is, when you know how to even say, okay, call out my sin, but let's not forget to deal with this sin. Okay. When you can do that, a lot of these arguments fall apart and then people they end up looking like jerks. But if you don't know that stuff, they're going to make you feel crazy and they're going to make you feel bad and sinful for simply trying to protect people or simply trying to talk about the truth. And then here's the last one that I'm going to cover, and I'm going to try to get into any questions that you guys have left today. I'm going to look in the chat, see if there's any questions that we haven't covered that I can get to. But Nate Bridges says, how about there should just be one big church so that no one can randomly start their own, like the Catholic Church? And guys, we get this all the time. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. A lot of people's answer, there's people who will say, well, everybody should just be Catholic or everybody should just be Orthodox, and we wouldn't have this problem. These are Protestant problems. The issue is that things like NDAs, like I told this person, things like NDAs are not just Protestant problems. Things like NDAs, these are existing in Catholic circles. They're going to exist in Orthodox circles. This is a church-wide problem. Spiritual abuse is not just a Protestant problem. It's a church-wide problem, okay? Just like sin is not a Protestant problem or a Catholic problem or an Orthodox problem, sin is a humanity problem, which also means it is a church problem, okay? So those are the big questions that we've got this week. If you have any questions and you hadn't put them in the chat yet, go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and try to see what questions that we have. Lucy has a question here. Lucy says, question, suppose a pastor takes a couple of quote unquote counseling sessions just to tie the person getting terminated so that they can talk about what the leader did to them. Okay. First of all, any counseling, Lucy, and this is a great question. Any counseling that a pastor does, those should be confidential. Okay. They should be confidential. That stuff is never coming out. Okay. Unless it poses an immediate physical danger to themselves or someone else. Pastors and church staff that are counseling should follow the same rules as a therapist, in my opinion. Okay. There's got to be great confidentiality there. Okay. And that's something that our Catholic brothers and sisters do really well with confession. Okay. That's why we allow for churches to use NDAs in that situation. Okay. We allow them to use NDAs that are making pastors say, I agree. I cannot, under any circumstances, share counseling information. Okay. But instead, what you're talking about, it happens a lot of times. There are church leaders who aren't holding themselves that standard, but they're using counseling sessions and private meetings to try to hold over your head or to try to hold hostage to justify what they're doing, to justify a termination, to justify removing a volunteer, to justify an NDA. And what I would say is, one, that is going to be sinful for them to use that counseling information against you that way. In my opinion, I think it's wrong. I think it's immoral. I would call it sinful, but definitely immoral, because even therapists have a higher standard than that. That's part of the problem. Pastors don't have a unified standard that they're held accountable to. Okay. But again, if they're using that against you to try to force you to sign an NDA or to try to blackmail you, that is definitely a problem, definitely a red flag. Okay. I would be very, very careful. Okay. She elaborates. She says, say someone is getting fired, but they don't want to sign the NDA. Can the leader say he took counseling sessions with the person and therefore they're getting fired and is now in a bind? So if you don't sign the NDA, can they make you look bad by saying, hey, there's private stuff I can't tell you from counseling, but look, just we know things you don't know, they had to get fired. Okay. That's not okay. Can they do it? Yes. Could you potentially take legal action against them? Yes. but it's wrong. Okay. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of churches do. So Lucy, sadly enough, I always tell people I would encourage you to tell the truth and to tell it early so that someone else doesn't write a narrative about you. Because if a church is telling something about you and you sign the NDA, you can't say that's a lie. They're making it sound like I have some sort of moral failure. And what you're describing is they almost imply that you had some sort of heinous moral failure and they're protecting you by not telling it. And then people don't ask questions. Okay. If you've signed the NDA, then you can't even speak and say what they're saying about me is a lie. If you haven't signed it, though, here's what we did, and this is what I recommend that people do. We published the NDA so that people would know, and we said, we're praying for this church. We're not against this church. We don't think this is right. But the other thing we did was we said, hey, we just want to let people know in our network, Candace was fired. Here's the reason why. Here's what we were told. If you hear anything different, please come and talk to us. Okay. We're heartbroken. Pray for us. Pray for the church. Boom. But by putting our story out there, it made it harder for other people to manipulate that story. Okay. So again, a pastor shouldn't do that, but they definitely can. Okay. Let me go ahead and see, just looking through the YouTube chat here. Brian says those that demand NDAs want to appear to be the glittering head of gold. Yep, I would agree. It's a concern. It's a concern when a church leader wants to give you an NDA. Okay. Lucy says, I think she was talking about Dusty using straw man arguments and ad hominem attacks means you've lost the debate. And that's the sad part. Guys, you see this. I'm not saying Dusty is a narcissist. I don't know Dusty, but you see this with a lot of narcissists. The very things they're accusing you of are the things that they're doing. And when you start pushing facts, they just leave and say things like, I'm not going to play in these comments anymore. So yeah, that is a problem. And definitely. Okay. Let me go ahead and see, looking through most of the comments, trying to see if there's any new ones because we've covered a lot. Okay. Let me see if there's anything in Instagram that I haven't covered yet. And if anybody wants to ask any more questions before we get off, go ahead and let me know right now because I don't see any that we haven't covered. But we wanted to answer as many of your questions about NDAs as possible. So the bottom line, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this project? Why are we going to this trouble? And why are we putting our necks out there, guys? Because again, this is already making churches upset. There's always the potential of churches trying to get back at us. There's a lot of heartburn this could cause us. So why are we doing it? We're doing it because in almost every spiritual abuse case that we have seen, we've also found NDAs. Okay. That doesn't mean that if a church is using a silencing NDA that they're abusive, but it does mean that almost every time we find spiritual abuse, we find an NDA as a part of it. So we are doing this because we believe that if the church could have open conversations about this, and if you knew as the church, your churches or the church in your community that's using NDAs, and if church leaders had to have open conversations about this, I really do believe, and I think our board agrees with this, but we believe that if that stuff was out in the open, there would be far less use of NDAs, if any, because NDAs lose their power when they're not kept secret. Silencing NDAs, let me clarify. Silencing NDAs lose their power when they're not kept in secret. Okay, good NDAs, you're fine if people know we use in these NDAs and why. Silencing NDAs, most church leaders never want anybody to find out. And if people find out, it's no longer worth it. Okay. And if it is, our hope and our assumption is that they can provide very good answers for the people around them. Okay. So if you see a church on this list and you still decide, I want to work for this church, more power to you. If you see a church on this database list and you say, I still want to attend this church, their answers were good, more power to you. The reason why we're doing this, though, is that we believe people have the right to know if silencing agreements or potential silencing agreements are being used or have been used before in their churches. Okay. Because I think, I think when we do that, again, if it doesn't end NDAs, I think it's going to come really, really close. And that's what we're excited about. So we know this is going to bother some people. We know it's going to bother some church leaders. We know it's going to bother some church attenders. We know it's going to bother some people like Dusty, but we're not worried about bothering people. We're worried about protecting people. So that's why we're doing this. So again, 100% voluntary, but if you have an NDA and you feel like it needs to be shared, you want to shine a light on a church that is using an NDA, go ahead. You can go to the website. You can see all of the disclaimers for that, all the important information, how you can do that. But also keep a lookout, guys. It is, I think, early October. We're going to start seeing the first churches on this list. We're walking through this with them. And my hope is that no church is on that list because they all make a public commitment to not use NDAs and we're celebrating them on the other list. But that's probably not reality. So this database and the other, which is being created right now, those are both going to start being populated in real time, being updated daily in early October. So go ahead and bookmark that. You can check that, share that with friends who are looking at different potential church jobs in the future. Share that with people if you see their church on that list so they can start conversations. Because again, we want to start those good conversations. But this is real. This is happening now. And in the first 48 hours, we've already started this process with 10 plus churches. So guys, the Safe Church Pledge, we did that, and that is going to take 18 to 36 months to start getting churches that we can push you to on these lists, to really start getting churches to do this. This tool is practical and almost automatic. Okay. So again, share this with anybody that you think needs it. Share episode 100. That is the best place for them to find out about this. If they have more questions, you can go ahead and send them to this live stream, or they can just ask us questions at any point. We're going to do our best to answer those. But guys, would you pray for us? This is the last thing I'm going to ask. Would you do two? Would you do potentially two things? Okay. One, I'm asking everybody, if you appreciate this project, you appreciate this work, would you pray for us? This has been very heavy. It causes a lot of anxiety. We don't know how churches are going to react. We've done everything that we can over 9 months to try to make sure that we are doing this above reproach. We're doing this legally, ethically, fairly. We want to do our best with this, but it is heavy. It is a struggle. And it does cause a lot of shrapnel to come our way. So one, would you pray for us? We would appreciate your prayers. And that's something I'm asking from everybody who's a praying person who believes in this project. I would ask that you would do that. But also, we know everybody's not in a place where they can. There's no manipulation. There's no expectation here. But if you are grateful to see projects like this happening, and you say we need more transparency and accountability in the church like this, would you consider, if you're in a place where you can, if you feel led to, would you consider giving a financial gift? Actually, most of the gifts that we get, most of the donations that we get are one time. Just by having consistent month by month recurring giving, it helps us out a ton. And the gifts that help us the most they're often like $10, $15, $25 a month. They're not huge, massive gifts, but knowing that money is coming in, it helps us to plan. Also, guys, we have really updated just from this past month. We have updated financial disclosures. If you ever want to know where the money's going, what's going with that, if you were donating, we have those available. We're going to start sending those to donors directly as well. But they're on our website. If you go over there, you're going to see nobody's getting rich off of this, guys. We don't have any full-time employees. We don't have part-time employees. We only pay contractors. But we brought in about $23,000 this year. It has helped pay for a lot of the legal expenses and stuff with this. But guys, projects like this, there's a lot of things coming that we are going to need more money for, if nothing else, probably for different legal expenses and stuff like that. So if you feel led, we would love it if you would consider partnering with us financially. You can do that at spiritualabuse.institute. But if not, that is totally okay. Every like, every comment, every share, every time you pray for us, every time you watch an episode or you watch a short or a reel, you are helping us tremendously. And we could not do this without you. So thank you for your support. You guys are absolutely awesome. Somebody on YouTube is asking, why is Jeff not rich? There's a lot of reasons why I'm not rich, but for those of you guys that don't know, in our bylaws, we actually have a cap on the most a contractor can make. So nobody will ever be making nobody will ever be making a six-figure anything from us, even if it's a big company contractor. We actually have to find somebody else to finish. So yeah, we're doing our best to be above reproach, and that's all we're asking churches to do with this conversation, with this database. We're asking them to be above reproach. We're asking them to do what the Bible said, not to be perfect, but to do their best to be open, to do their best to be honest. So anyway, love you guys. We're grateful for you. Thank you to everyone who is already supporting this project, whether that is giving us a mission, whether it's sharing it with someone else, whether it's giving, praying for us. Help us get the word out on this project, because we think it's going to change the game. We think it's going to bring real reform to the church. And guys, I think it's going to be lasting reform. What if 5 years from now, churches that went to a different tool. They're trying, if they're going to try this stuff, it's something new that we're looking at. What if silencing NDAs were no longer a tool they were using simply because we shined the light on this issue? That's my hope. That's my prayer. That's how we're going to end the stream today. But guys, I appreciate y'all so much. We love you, and I'll see you on another stream soon.